Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and what I have for you today is kind of an impressions video, informal review, if you will, of this LK Chen Magnificent Chu Jian. So since this is more of an impressions video and not a full formal review, I have no notes about what I'm going to talk about, so this is probably going to be a bit more rambly than my normal reviews, a little bit less structured. And I'm pretty much just going to say what comes to mind as I am holding this, moving it around, and talking about it. So it's important to note this is not my sword. It was sent to me by another sword reviewer as part of a bunch of LK Chen swords that are kind of making their way around a variety of reviewers to, make videos about them. And it's made it to me now. So this is a loaner sword. I do have to move it on once I'm done with it and all the other swords. And it's important to note that this is a well-used sword. All of the ones in this bunch of swords are quite well used. It's one of the reasons I'm not doing full reviews for them, because they have enough wear and tear on them that reviewing them as new, it doesn't make sense. To me, it just makes it a little wonky to do a full review on such well-used swords. And one of the places you can most see how well used the sword is in the scabbard, especially right here. Hopefully you can see that. It is kind of splitting apart a little bit. And it's the cord wrap here is starting to come loose. It's actually got a pretty good fit still, and it holds it in. I never know how the fit's going to be when I'm in the desert. If you've watched my videos, you've seen I have quite a few problems because of how dry the humidity is here. But also we use a swamp cooler, an evaporative cooler in the house a lot of the time, and that pumps humidity into the house. I think that contrast kind of wreaks some small degree of havoc with some wood core scabbards. One thing that is really cool about this scabbard is that this design on it, normally if you get one of these from LK Chen, this is going to be like stenciled on or something like that. This design is actually completely hand painted, which to me says this is probably one of the first ones they made of this scabbard, and maybe it was even the prototype. I don't know, but if you look close, you can definitely see the handmade nature of it, the hand painted. It's not going to be as crisp as the decals or the stencils, but it's going to look more natural and better, in my opinion. Now, I should mention the price of this sword. From LK Chen, this sword retails for $395, and at least to me, the shipping from LK Chen is $70. You can also buy this at Kult of Athena. Their list price is a little bit higher due to the shipping, but then you have to pay them shipping and tax as well. What I've generally found is if you buy it from Kult of Athena, it might be a little bit cheaper than direct from LK Chen. However, at the time of recording, Kult of Athena doesn't have any of these in stock, and you can order it directly from LK Chen. I will put a link in the description to both LK Chen's listing and Kult of Athena's. If you happen to buy from the Kult of Athena link, be aware that I do get a small referral bonus for any purchases through that link. Now, one of the really cool things about being able to handle a variety of these LK Chen swords, including this Jian, is the opportunity to see how they differ from European swords, from Japanese swords, the ones that I'm more familiar with. And it also gives me a good incentive to learn more about the history of China, and especially their weapons. And I've done a little bit of research and kind of learned a little bit about this sword and the type it would be used, the time period. But I also have a friend who is also a YouTuber that knows a whole lot more about Chinese history and Chinese weaponry. And he agreed to provide some footage talking about the sword, its history. So here we go.
Thanks so much for having me, Kyle. Sword friend Dlatrex is here to talk a little bit about the history of the Magnificent Chu Jian. This starts really in the Chinese Bronze Age, in the Warring States period. This is a time where weapons were primarily either maces or axes, and the swords that were in use were only double-edged and straight swords and were relatively short. So the Jian dominated during this time more than 2,000 years ago. even though the majority of the various warring factions and states utilized bronze and had relatively short weapons, a few of these states, including the state of Chu, were able to manufacture and refine iron and create longer weapons out of iron and eventually steel. And that allowed the designs of the blades to, over time, improve and lengthen. What we see here is a blade that is, this sword is a composite of several different finds that were found in China in areas from the Chu state, found in the mid to late 20th century. And the finds date back to basically any time during the just pre-unification China, so the late warring state period. And it's not a single sword, but again, you have guard elements, pommel cap elements, and blades that are all representative of swords from these tomb finds that are dated to the early 4th century all the way to the early 3rd century BC. Thinking about the most famous sword, perhaps, of this period, the sword of Jian, came from the state of Yue. That sword, as famous as it is, was not found in the region of Yue. It was actually found in the Chu state. And so it probably predates this particular design by 100 to 200 years. Chu eventually subjugated the state of Yue and took it over. But the similar features that you can find on that famous sword, you can find on this later steel sword design. You have the very small handguard, you have the flattened disc pommel, you have a blade that starts out reasonably wide and then tapers as it continues along. It's a little hard to see on camera, but it's a little bit more apparent when we're in person. And so what's interesting is you have things that are very unique to the time period. The elements here are still made of bronze and cast, which would have been just like you would find on the earlier bronze designs. Not to be overlooked is the end of this disc pommel here at the end, which has intricate spirals here on the end. This is not by accident. This was representative of how influential or wealthy you were. It was very difficult to create these designs at the time, and so by having a lot of these fancy designs on the pommel, it showed that you were a person of status. Similarly, the relatively little handguard on here is very intricate and fancy. So if we look at the guard, it also features these intricate patterns, including this kind of monster-looking face called a taotie. This was a common monstrous design that was seen in period and reoccurs. Although these elements are blanked and kind of embossed outwards, in period, if you were wealthy enough, you would have these filled in with semi-precious stones, so with glass or turquoise or even jade. So perhaps I'll take the time in the future to go ahead and fill those in and make it a kind of colorful blade. So in addition to the beautiful overall shape and wasting that we have here in the blade, that is mirrored in the beautiful scabbard that comes with it. So the scabbard, which is lacquered, and this is based on surviving examples that were able to survive more than 2,000 years. We see this same basic design continue from the Warring States period through unification into the Han Dynasty. It mirrors the overall silhouette of the blade, where it has this kind of it's technically a hexagonal cross section, but it's kind of like a flattened diamond here, and then it transitions to a kind of lenticular section over here. It's got this beautiful shape that kind of mirrors the same sort of monstrous design over on this end. And over here we have, this is a decal, but originally these would have been painted on designs. This is consistent with the style of Chu artwork that is found. This is the Phoenix Rising design that is seen. We can find it on examples of Chu pottery and Chu furniture that have these type of red florid kind of colors. Again, we have a bronze belt loop, so this is intended to be worn with the belt loop facing outward and the belt slipping through this, and allows the sword to be worn along the torso and passed through on either side. So this kind of design led what was to become the last stage for primary military use Jian, that would start first in the unified Qin dynasty and then into the Han dynasty, where it eventually switches over to the Dao. It's a beautiful sword that's intended for someone of wealth and status who's trying to show off their import, but it is still made to be supremely deadly and supremely effective. So both a showpiece and a well-executed and dangerous piece to be used on or off the battlefield. That's all for now, so now back to Alientude.
Thanks for collaborating. For all my viewers, check out his channel. He's got a good number of videos and has a really great style. I have a link to it in the description. So a quick overview of the features of this sword. It's quite plain in the hilt with just a little butt cap that, as was mentioned before, has some detailing on it, a detailed, very minor guard, and just a cord wrap texture, a cord wrap grip here. I believe there's some Samigawa underneath that, and then of course wood there. It's a very effective grip. I can hold it and move around the sword around very well, and edge alignment works very well. Even though it's nearing cylindrical, it's not cylindrical. It's certainly thicker than it is, or it's certainly wider than it is thick, but it's not notably, it's approaching cylindrical. It's not cylindrical, but it is approaching, and it's good enough for me to get good edge alignment, and that's really one of the most important things you can ask for in a grip. I will say though, even if I grip it like this and I try to crank on the guard, I really can't twist it in my hand, and a lot of that is due to the risers in here. They really help my hands lock into place. I'm not sure if it just happens to be my hand that it fits my fingers really well, but they work very, very well. The blade is just beautiful. It's pattern welded. I will put the LK Chen's specifications of what steels it is up on the screen here. And it's a beautiful pattern. LK Chen does this on a lot of their swords, and they don't go crazy with the acid etch to bring out that pattern like crazy. It's definitely there, noticeable, but it's not like some of the cheaper pattern welding stuff, the stuff that is marketed as Damascus. It's much more subtle and more appropriate for what it should look like, in my opinion. The other thing that's really cool about this is the double fullers here. You know, it's kind of weird calling them fullers because they're quite shallow, and it's almost more like just a different geometry. It's almost like extra sides of the sword rather than a fuller, but it could even be considered hollow ground here rather than a fuller. To clarify what I'm talking about, rather than describing these as fullers, I think it makes the most sense to say that this is an octagonal cross-section with some hollow grinding in it. And to better illustrate that, here would be a diamond cross-section, here would be an octagonal cross-section, and here is a octagonal with hollow grinding. In any case, it's a quite complex blade geometry. One thing that I will say though, while the center ridge is the thickest part of the sword, when you get to this other ridge here where the primary bevel starts, it is thinner than the central ridge, but not by a lot. And because it's quite close to the edge, there's not much room for the edge to bevel into the final edge, which means that it doesn't have the best geometry for cutting because it doesn't have enough space or enough room to get a really nice acute edge geometry. Instead, it's going to be a little bit obtuse. And that came through when I was cutting with it. I really like moving it around. It's a lot of fun to move around, and it's very easy to control. I just really struggled to get pretty much any good clean cuts with this sword. I think there's a couple things going on. First is that geometry. Secondly, this is again a pretty well used sword. So it's seen a good amount of cutting tests and probably harder targets than I cut. I think the edge is diminished a little bit and could probably be used to just be rehoned a little bit, and that would probably help. Because, you know, I'm running my fingers along it. It doesn't feel particularly sharp. It's still effectively sharp. I certainly wouldn't want to get hit by it in a swung in earnest, but it doesn't feel like it's really hair-popping sharp or even close to that. So that's probably one of the other major reasons I struggled cutting with it. What the sword is really good at, though, is tip control and thrusting. It has a lot of tip control. I'm not sure exactly where it's balanced, but it's actually it's interesting. Look how far out it's balanced. Not exact. That looks like about 5 to 6 inches. I'm not sure exactly, but it doesn't feel like there's much weight out here at all. That means that there's going to be a lot of meat back here, and it has excellent tip control. So it feels like a thruster, even though it's balanced more like what I'm used to as a cutter. But what I can also say is, while the guard does stick out enough that I don't feel like I'm in danger of my hand running up the blade and cutting myself, that's just on lighter targets. Like if I'm just holding the sword like this and just kind of butting my hand up, you can see it's not moving. But if I hit something really hard and, you know, there's shock, I could see my hand slipping off this and potentially grabbing the blade. So it's just a little bit scary thrusting with this kind of sword. There's other Chinese swords that have even less of a guard like this and would be even scarier. So this one has enough that I think it's not too bad. I would just be kind of nervous on something that could really make my hand slide forward. Another reason I think this sword is well suited to thrusting is how rigid it is. If you look, it doesn't vibrate here very much at all. And if I just take it and flex it, it definitely has some flex, there's no doubt about that. But the majority of the blade is extremely stiff, and it only starts flexing right about here. So that's going to make it quite an effective thruster, because it's not going to, when you impact, it's not going to bend, it's going to penetrate, which is so very important when you're thrusting. Flexible swords, overly flexible swords aren't really going to be good at penetrating, because instead of the energy going into the target, the energy is going to flex the blade rather than, like I said, penetrating into the target. And just one other kind of speculative concept I had is with this flat of a pommel cap, butt cap, I don't know exactly what you would call it. It feels like if you were going against a target in armor, you could even thrust. Like if the target was down, you could put your hand on this and thrust down and really get a lot of weight and pressure onto it. I have no idea if that was done historically. I don't know what the armor in China looked like when this kind of sword was in use. But I think you could also do something like that if you needed to, and get a little bit more oomph into your thrust. Now, from what I know of Chinese martial arts, which is basically nothing, I think, from what I understand, they don't do a lot of big sweeping motions that are more akin to the type of cuts I'm most used to. I think they're more wrist-based. Very quick flicks, which I'm not good at all. But that's my impression of Chinese swordsmanship in general. And this sword is very well suited for that. It has a lot of nimbleness, like I said, which to me is just so surprising when you consider that the point of balance is, what is that? It's like 5 or 6 inches. I will see if I can I'll get it measured and put it up on the screen what the point of balance is. But for that far forward, this is amazingly nimble and a lot of fun to move around. So that's pretty much my thoughts on this sword. I've really enjoyed having the chance to move around and try it out. And I think that, this one is one of the ones that's in better condition of the different ones that LK Chen has sent me. And I think that it is, from what I can see, I think it would be worth your $395, right around there, for this sword, plus 50, 60 bucks, including tax, shipping, however you want to get it. I do think it's worth it. I think LK Chen has such a great deal on so many of their swords, and they are filling a niche that very few people are filling. And I want to encourage them to keep doing that. I think they're doing a great job. And I also want to say thank you to KK for sending me this sword and the variety of other ones that were sent to me, including some of the newer ones. I've got actually a lot of LK Chens in my house right now, so you're going to be seeing a good amount of content coming forward with them. But until that time, Alien Tude out.